Irish Nation, welcome to the show. Notre Dame blows out the Naval Academy 51-14. And as Brett announced on the show last week, or maybe more hinted at last week, we have a special guest, sort of. And for those not watching on YouTube, Brett is actually in his Halloween costume. So go out on YouTube and check this out. Brett, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Mike. Happy to be here.
So Brett, do you consider this costume to technically be Connor Stalions, or is this just a hypothetical assistant coach at Central Michigan?
I've been referring to this costume as an unnamed coach, so the latter. Although Stalions did go to the Naval Academy, so I guess for purposes of this show, I think it's also fitting if I go by Connor Stalions for recapping the Notre Dame Navy game.
Yeah, when I'm picturing Connor Stalions, this is the image that comes to my head first. So I think, I don't know. Regardless of your intent here, it seems like you nailed what I would consider Connor Stalions to be. So, So Brett, let's stay on the topic here. What's the latest on this Stalions Michigan scandal?
So Stalions came out in a Netflix documentary about a month and a half ago now and denied that he was on the Central Michigan sideline. Specifically, he said he couldn't recall, quote unquote, couldn't recall if he was on the sideline. And meanwhile, an NCAA investigation has since indeed confirmed he was at the Central Michigan game. They have apparently a draft of the investigations report. It's stuck in bureaucracy land, getting reviewed by every lawyer under the sun, still waiting for final determination. So I guess technically the jury is still out as we speak on whether or not Connor Stalions was actually on the Central Michigan sideline.
Yeah, this is still one of the craziest headlines I can recall. In college football, you get a lot of crazy headlines. This is near the top, though. It's just if Stalions was not on the sideline, as he alleges, then who was it? It's just like there hasn't been anyone else who you could point to who it would be. Like presumably Central Michigan, they know all their grad assistants, their assistant coaches, alumni. So there's just not really a large group of people on the sideline that are just like floating around that you don't know. So if you're not Connor Stalions, then who the heck are you?
Yeah, like they have payroll. Central Michigan University's employer, they have W-2. So presumably the unnamed coach that I am is either, that I am for Halloween, just to be clear, is either Connor Stalions or someone employed by the university. Like there's just not that many options. So apparently I don't have any family. I don't have any friends. I'm not on the payroll. Internet sleuths haven't been able to figure out who I am. No one can confirm that I even exist. But I, in this costume, am absolutely positively not Connor Stalions.
I would love it if there was just a guy who who's not Connor Stalions, who looks exactly like this, and then he just happened to shave his goatee right after the game, and he threw away his hat, and they just haven't been able to pinpoint it. But
amazing.
Yeah, this is like such a crazy topic, but I think this is probably, what is this, like a third episode that we've talked about this?
I think so. Like, I think we're becoming Connor Stallion conspiracy theorists, and we might be a little bit too obsessed. So I'd suggest we've got the costume going. I'm going to roll with it and laugh through this whole week. Although I've actually been playing around with this mustache. Like, whenever I laugh in it, my face just looks distorted. So apologies to any people out there if I'm scaring you. But let's get back to Notre Dame football and discuss what's going on for the Irish.
Yeah, if I had no context on Connor Stalions and I just was watching this, I would assume this is like some sort of, I'd assume we were talking about the Kennedy assassination or something, It'd just be like very
made the mustache pop off.
Yeah,
I gotta get this thing back on.
Yeah, this is a conspiracy theory podcast. But
I'm just picturing someone never having heard of our show accidentally stumbling on this episode. That would be very confusing. I'm sorry if you are that person.
We could not look any different right now either. I'm just wearing like a pink like t-shirt, like a nice pink shirt. Brett looks like he's about to, throw away his cell phone because he thinks the CIA is tracking him.
Okay, let's keep moving.
Okay. Well, anyway, so bye week. So eat your cheeseburgers this week. Shorter show.
We'll cover the Navy. Cheeseburger. 2 buys this week.
Cheeseburger.
We get 2 cheeseburgers on the season.
2 cheeseburgers. Can't complain about that. So we'll cover the Navy game this episode, and then we're just going to look at how good. This is a common theme that Brett and I always talk about, is just how great this defense has been this year. So we're gonna try to put that into historical context. And spoiler alert, this is one of Notre Dame's best units on either side of the ball in the last 40 years. So with that, let's get into the Navy game. Brett, I'm curious to hear your reactions to this game.
Yeah, one of the stranger games I think we've covered here in the last 3 or 4 years on the show. And so I tried to do the good old classic, describe this game in one word. And I played around with a couple. The word I came up with, though, the most was just misleading. This was a misleading outcome where I think it was, by all accounts, probably our worst defensive performance of the year. Still pretty good. Only give up 14 points and forced technically 6 turnovers. But this was just Navy completely handing the game to us. 2 muffed punts, 2 missed pitches by their quarterback. Their quarterback also just dropped the ball while trying to throw it, threw another interception. They had another one that they recovered. Like they just could not stop doing the proverbial shoot yourself in the foot. And post game win expectancy is always a great way to look at these things. There's a couple different ways it's measured. And really the big question is whether or not you count turnovers as lucky or as, part of the game enforced. So collegefootballdata.com looks at turnovers as pure luck. And so when they calculate post-game win probability, they look at all the plays in the game as if turnovers didn't happen. And we only had a 69% expected win probability. I can't think of a 51-14 football game where the post-game expected win probability wasn't 100%. Like that's a pretty, 30% of the time, if you just redo the plays, but don't fumble the ball a bajillion times, Navy wins the game 30% of the time. Now, Bill Connolly, he factors in turnovers differently than collegefootballdata.com. He had Notre Dame as a 100% post-game win expectancy. So I got it. Different ways to look at the data. But I just think everything about this game was just misleading, but sure feels good to come out of that winning 51-14 versus something that's misleading and is just sheer chaos.
Yeah, agree. I think if these turnovers were, say we were sacking Blake Horvath, right? Say we were hitting his blind side and then he was coughing it up that way, right? Or we had more interceptions as opposed to scooped up fumbles. I think that I would feel a little bit differently about this. I think it does feel like Navy was shooting. Look, I think we played well, but Navy definitely was shot themselves in the foot to an extent that I've never seen a Navy team make errors
It's
like this
crazy.
before.
It's
Yeah,
crazy.
I think if they play a clean game, I look, they're definitely not winning this game, but it could have, there could have been it could have been maybe a little stressful through like the first half. I do think one element that was pretty key to this game is that our defense didn't have their best performance. Still good. Our offense, this was you got to put it in context because it's not like Navy has a great defense exactly, but I thought this was one of the best performances our offense has had all year. They really stepped up in this game. So I think that that was a key element. We're going to talk about that a little bit more, but yeah, I think what our offense did, that would have been enough for us to win the game no matter what. But it is a bit misleading. You see this if you didn't watch the game, you'd think, oh wow, Notre Dame just absolutely annihilated Navy, and technically we did, but it's like when you dig into the stats a little bit more, there's a little more nuance to it than I think you would expect. So, but I think before we dive into the offense, I'm just gonna there are a couple of things I want to flag here because anytime you play Navy against anytime you're playing the option, there's some considerations here. One for me that's always on the top of my radar. Something that I'm always worried about is just when we tend to play a lot of option. If we have 2 option games in a year, or anytime we play an option team, it seems like we tend to get more banged up. It seems like Navy they block a little bit lower. They're kind of borderline chop blocks. Sometimes they actually are chop blocks, but the NCAA has cracked down on those types of blocks a bit more. So I think one key for me from this game is that it seems like we came out of it intact. It seems like we're healthy. I can just think of years in the past where we have a bunch of ankle injuries, knee injuries, and it seems like we were able to avoid that, which is key because that's people talk about Navy hangovers, and Brent, me and you have talked about it. It seems like that's a little overstated at times. But one thing that I don't think is overstated is in the past, like sometimes we would actually have players get dinged up, and that would hurt us down the line. And then I think another element here is the option is such a different animal, and the Navy has, like as we talked about last week, they have a very unique take on the option. I think we still have another option team on our schedule. We have Army, and actually Army in the advanced stats, they rank quite a bit better than Navy does. So should be a tougher test. I think these were crucial reps for that Army game. And by all accounts, statistically, that's a game that we should be favored by a notable margin. But to the extent that you can get ahead of a game like that, to the extent that you can get these reps against the option, which otherwise you're normally not going to get, that makes me feel more comfortable going into that game. So I thought those were a couple key things to highlight before we dive into this game a little bit more. But yeah, Brett, we talked about the offense. I mentioned the offense. I thought this was like a big highlight for our performance today or performance yesterday. So yeah, curious to kind of hear your takes on our offensive performance.
Yeah, I think it's the right place to start because the Navy triple option just mitigates so much what you'd want to look at in a defense, right? Like you just have to prepare so much differently, you play so much differently. And whether you play super well or super poorly, I don't know how predictive it is for the next game. Their defense, though, is trying to do what just about every other defense in college football does. They run a, pretty basic scheme that looks and feels like a college football defense, and they do it okay. They rank, in the mid 60s in defensive efficiency. They're right around where Miami of Ohio, Georgia Tech, UVA, Army, USC. So a few opponents we have coming up, a few we've already played. They're kind of right in the middle of that pack. And this was absolutely dismantling. It doesn't matter how many turnovers they had, how many times they shot themselves in the foot. Riley Leonard and Mike Denbrock generated a 59% success rate. Just for context, if offenses are in the mid 40s, they're humming. For context, Notre Dame's defense just doesn't let anyone get above 40, 41%. We'll get back to that in a minute. This game was an exception to that. So Notre Dame being in the 59% success rate range was up there for what we were doing against Purdue. Like this was, I think, by far our second best offensive performance just from an efficiency perspective. And I really thought it started with the offensive line. I get it. This is where they should have the talent mismatch. This is where Navy should struggle. On offense with the triple option, Navy can mitigate that talent mismatch by what they do in scheme. That's much harder to do on the other side of the ball. But our offensive line went and took care of business. 0 sacks allowed and 3.2 yards rushing before contact. I think that was the highest number we had this year. So in terms of the push that was being generated for Jeremiah Love and Jadarian Price and Riley Leonard, it was the best push we saw all year. That should happen in these games. It's awesome that it did to see that play out.
Definitely. And yeah, I think another key thing, yeah, the run blocking, this is what we had been talking about in prior weeks. In order for our offense to become more consistent, we would need our offensive line to step up and generate more push, to block more effectively on these runs. And we saw that this game, which is, I think, if you're looking for how likely it is that this offense continues to grow and continues to hit its potential, that was one key element. So again, it's just one data point, but still, it's exactly what we want to see. The pass blocking was also great this game. No sacks. All of our offensive linemen graded out really well on a pass blocking standpoint on Pro Football Focus. So I think, yeah, a good day in the office. Billy Schrauth is healthy, so he was back in the lineup. That's key. I think he's our most talented offensive lineman. So it's probably not a coincidence that we had a good offensive line performance when Billy Schrauth gets back into the lineup. So great to see. Now, Riley Leonard, always a key topic of the offense. I thought this might have been his best game, honestly. So his stats don't. It's not like they totally fly off the page. If you were just if you didn't have any context and you're just looking at it, he was 13 for 21, 178 yards, 2 touchdowns, right? Average yardage per attempt of 8.5. So good, but I don't think that necessarily paints the full picture of his performance. I think just even watching him throughout the game, he seemed as comfortable as I've seen him this year in the pocket. You could rewind multiple clips. I feel like he was staying in the pocket. He was feeling, he was kind of feeling the pressure effectively. He was stepping up when he needed to. He was taking off and running when he needed to. He was letting plays develop. I thought he looked very, very comfortable and confident as a quarterback, better than he has all year. So I think this is, as we've been hoping that Riley Leonard is going to continue to step up, continue to improve. And I think we've been seeing that. He actually graded out as a 91 on Pro Football Focus, which was the highest on the team. And that's an elite grade. Again, it's against the Navy's defense, which is not exactly an elite defense. They're not a terrible defense, but they're like an average defense. So still, Riley Leonard was not doing this earlier in the year against bad teams. So for him to do this against an average defense, I think that's a big step forward. And the key element here was that his grade was driven by his passing grade as opposed to his running grade. Some of his higher grades in the past have been driven more by the run. Here, he was getting it done through the pass. I think two elements that we saw him struggle with a bit in the past was his how he performed against pressure. So everyone's going to do worse when every quarterback's going to do worse when they're pressured. Riley Leonard had a particularly big drop off this season. He's had a really big drop off when he's been under pressure. This game, like there was a drop off, but it definitely was not nearly as severe as it has been in the past. So he still graded out well against pressure. I mentioned there were many times this game where there was some pressure that was coming his way, and he handled it pretty effectively. And then the other key area that I thought he looked better in was for deeper throws. So if you're looking at if you were just like kind of to take record of every throw that he had, where he did particularly well, where he was most impressive in this game, was in the deep and medium average depth of target throws. So anything 20 plus yards, this is where he excelled this game. So he had 4 attempts that were 20 plus yards. He completed 3 of them, got a touchdown, and generally just looked very comfortable. And this was definitely not something that he was comfortable with earlier in the year. And then even in more of these intermediate ranges, 10 to 19 yards, he excelled here too. So I think if you're looking for there are multiple positive takeaways for the offense, but if you're looking at one of the top ones, this is certainly one that you have to focus in on. And I think Riley Leonard, hitting his stride, looking his best at this point in the season, as we're starting to become a playoff contender again. I think that that's exactly what you want to see. I think it gives me hope that if we win out and we make it to the playoff, heck, we might actually have the offense peaking at the right time when we're playing against some tougher defenses.
I completely agree with all that with one nuance. He still isn't throwing the ball well when he's under pressure. So when under pressure, he was 1 for 4 for 5 yards.
Yeah.
But why he got that high grade is he scrambled for 3 first downs when under pressure. And he only scrambled 3 times. So, out of the 7 times he was under pressure, he picked up 4 first downs by way of 1 completion on a short yardage situation and scrambling for 3 first downs. So there's a little bit of a, if you're not playing Navy and someone can keep him a little better contained and still under pressure, just a flag we should keep watching for. I thought the other guy that really jumped off the page on offense was Jeremiah Love. He's starting to be in that conversation for an All-American campaign. I think one of the problems for him being an All-American this year is Ashton Genty at Boise State, right, is the favorite to win the Heisman right now. And so, Love's numbers aren't quite as gaudy. He's only 51st in yards among running backs right now. But when you start digging into it, the advanced metrics are pretty crazy. He is 15th in yards after contact per rush. So he's a top 15 running back in total yards. He's also 15th in missed tackles forced. So, other teams just not being able to get him to the ground. And the interesting part of that is he only has 88 carries on the year. And all 14 of the guys that are, ahead of him in missed tackles forced, all have over 120 carries. And so when you break it down, his missed tackles per run is about 0.5. So every other run, he's breaking a tackle. That is the highest clip among those top 15 running backs in the country. So I get it. He's not getting enough touches. He's not the center point of the offense because we just have too much balance. We have Jadarian Price. We have Riley Leonard running the ball a lot. There's a lot of reasons he's just not the bell cow running the ball 20, 25 times a game that I think you probably need to be to win an award like the All-American stuff that I think is a little bit more headline stats. When you break down what he's doing with the football and just getting in the end zone, game in and game out, really impressive. And in this one, he goes for over 100 yards. He breaks another 4 tackles. He went for 8.5 yards per carry, had the 64-yard touchdown, just does so many little things right in this game, like he's been doing all year. Just, I thought, super impressive performance to pace the offense.
Yeah, I agree. And then I'm just going to rewind back a little bit. Yeah, with Riley Leonard under pressure, I think when I was talking about that, the thing to note is he had been really, really bad under pressure in prior games. And yeah, I'm with you, Brent. I wouldn't say
forward. For
he
sure,
wasn't good. He was not excelling, but it was an improvement. So
absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, so, I think one other thing I want to call out here is the wide receivers. I think this is also happening at the same time that Riley Leonard is taking step forwards. I think we're finally seeing these receivers become a bit more consistent, have a bit more of an impact. We're seeing that depth that was getting a lot of hype in the offseason. 3 different guys with a 40-plus yard catch. So, again, this is exactly what you want to be seeing at this time of the year. It took longer. I think it took a little bit longer than we were expecting, but it seems like we may be finally seeing the offense that we were expecting at the beginning of the year. Now, moving to the defense, this is an interesting game where the fun part of the recap is when we're talking about the offense. It's actually honestly kind of like a nice change of pace. But moving to the defense, yeah, look, I think anytime you give up 14 points, you can't say that that's a bad performance. But Notre Dame football's defense is such a high standard that I think you gotta use a different reference point. It's like, okay, are we playing at the standard that we are expecting week in and week out? Are we playing like a top five defense? And I think when you look at that standard, when you're using that as the measuring point, I think this is probably this. I don't know if this was our worst game of the year defensively, but I think it potentially could have been. I think it's one thing that's tricky though when you play Navy is the triple option is so different than any other type of offense that you're going to face. It's difficult to, I guess, glean too many takeaways. It just doesn't translate to how you necessarily perform against other types of defense. It's hard to prepare for. Notre Dame's more familiar with it than other teams, but still, it's just totally different technique. You'll put in different types of players too in many scenarios. So, a type of player who excels against the option, maybe someone that you don't really play a whole lot the rest of the year. I think it was like Greer Martini. I think that was a player from a few years back. He was a guy who's excelled against the option, and he would still get playing time other games, but not nearly as much. So it's just a totally different animal. I think there were a lot of turnovers this game. So, and a lot of them, as we mentioned, most of them were just Navy making stupid errors. So I think just across the board with the defense, my high level takeaway is I don't think it was our best game, but it's really hard to judge and I guess come up with particularly strong takeaways given that it's against the triple option, given that there were a lot of turnovers. But yeah, Brett, curious to hear your thoughts on this.
I completely agree. I think some things that stood out to me, and I think you've maybe touched on some of these, but just their success rate of 46% is higher than where it should be for Notre Dame, but it's also where Navy wants to be. Like Navy's triple option generates a lot of 3, 4, 5, 6 yard runs, and that will churn out higher success rates. And I think if you go back to the NIU game, no opponent has been over 41%. In fact, no opponent's been over 41% except for NIU and Texas A&M that were at 40 and 41%. So this is the most effective an opposing offense was at staying on schedule against Notre Dame's defense. Is that something to be on the lookout for against Army? For sure. Like that's something that makes me a little more nervous coming out of this game. That's maybe the only other takeaway. I thought the other thing that I was surprised there actually weren't more chunk plays. And I say that because watching the game, I thought Navy's explosiveness was having a really big impact. They had the 60-yard touchdown run by their quarterback, Horvath. They had 2 catches for over 20 yards. It felt like they were just running trickery left and right, and it was working. But if you step back and look, that 60-yard touchdown run and a completion for 21 yards and a completion for 20 yards was their only explosiveness on the day. Everything else was like 15 yards or less. And 3 explosiveness plays, it sucks one of them was a 60-yard touchdown, but 3 explosiveness plays spread out over a game won't kill your chances. And so, we got a ton of breaks with missed field goals and the turnovers and everything else we've talked about. But I think if we were going to make Navy string together long drives, rushing for 4 or 5 yards here, 3 yards there, 6 yards there, which is largely what we did with the exception of the Horvath 60-yard touchdown run, this was going to be a really tough game for Navy. And so I'm not surprised if you would have told me going in that Navy got the success rate where it was, but there wasn't explosiveness. I was actually more worried about the opposite happening. And I thought by and large, we kept it in check. I just want to reiterate, I think the biggest takeaway from this game for our defense is that there's just not a takeaway. Like you can't sit and look at this Navy game and extrapolate how you're going to do against Florida State or UVA or USC. And I think it's even hard to extrapolate against how you're going to do against Army, because I think this game is a great rep for Army where there's going to be so much to learn from, so much to take in, so much to see on film, so much to point out to the guys in practice, where that jump from game 1 against an option to game 2 against the option should be really, really meaningful experience for this team going into that one. So Mike, what else did we miss? I know I got one on the officials. I'll come back to that in a second. Um, how do you think this impacts you? You kind of touched on it in the beginning. I'm curious, does this game help us with the eye test and the playoff committee? I tend to think the eye test and all of that jargon, like at the end of the day, your record matters, the advanced stats matter, and that's what the committee gets into. But I'm even already just seeing a lot of people being like, whoa, Notre Dame blew out Navy 51-14, and that's a blowout against a ranked win. Like, do you think that helps our resume, or is that just a bunch of, talking heads in the media?
I think it definitely did. We'll have to see what the committee thinks when the rankings come out. We're getting pretty close. It's not this Tuesday, but the following Tuesday. That's when the first rankings come out. But if I just look at what happened in the AP poll, I think we were number 12 going into this game. And then there were a couple things that happened, but one is that we blew out Navy. The final score was it was an impressive final score. So, and I think even people who watched the game, like I mentioned, our offense was doing whatever they want. Navy was making a lot of errors, but I think regardless, it's hard to not, I guess, look at this game and see it as a positive data point for Notre Dame, even if you do make all these caveats. And then the other thing that happened was Texas A&M beat LSU, and so that just looks better for us because Texas A&M looks like a good team. But we jumped 4 spots, so I would have to assume part of that is the fact that we just absolutely blew out a ranked team. So yeah, to answer your question, Brett, I think absolutely. I think look, I know the advanced stats had Navy more as like a top. I don't know. I think they were like around like late 60s or something like that, somewhere in that range. But from a perception standpoint, from a press standpoint, people viewed them as a very solid team. So I think that this is look. It's not like we beat a top 15 Big Ten or SEC team, but it's a solid win, no question. I think a couple other takeaways I want to mention real quick is, yeah, special teams. There was something we were texting about during the game. I think I feel like at times this year it's been an asset. At times we've missed field goals, we've made mistakes. This is a game where it was like a bit of a mix, right? I think we one thing that we need Mitch Jeter to come back. So for me, I don't see it as much of a concern right now because I think once Mitch Jeter is healthy, I think we'll have more consistency on field goals. And actually, SP Plus has us as like a top 20 special teams unit. So it's a little hard to evaluate, but I think I think our special teams is actually in an okay spot. And I think we're going to be better once we get Mitch Jeter back. And I think there have been games like, Georgia Tech, for instance, there have been times that special teams has been a massive asset for us. And so I think we'll continue to hopefully see a bit more of that.
For sure. My last one that I just preluded to, I thought this was probably the worst officiating game of the year. Um, I have a propensity to sound off on refs. I try to do it less frequently. But this was like the very first drive of the game. Jeremiah Love got stopped on 2nd and 6 to force third down. And a Navy defender that tackled Love got his shoe off on the tackle and threw it 15 yards upfield, almost hit an official. Like, it's an automatic unsportsmanlike penalty. It's just a misapplication of the playbook to not call that. If you remember a few years ago, a Florida player did the same thing in a pivotal moment against LSU, wound up taking a back-breaking penalty and costing them the game. Like, there's just an automatic penalty to miss. Riley Leonard had a massive run that was brought back on a holding call by Emil Wagner. And looking back in the replay, like, it was textbook blocking technique. Defender goes to the ground. There's just a great block by Wagner. Wagner falls on top of him. Like, just not holding. It's just like there's nothing in there that remotely resembled a hold. I thought the roughing the passer penalty that extended a drive for them. Watching the replay, like, we clearly just didn't land on the quarterback. Like we landed on the quarterback side and not directly on top. They had another play where it was an 8-yard completion. It set up a 2nd and short that they ultimately wound up converting. But their running back caught the ball 8 yards down the field and was standing next to an offensive lineman blocking for him 7 yards down the field. And the field judge was right there. And it's just like, that's just an ineligible lineman downfield. Like, there were multiple times where things happen in the game, and it's not that a guy was out of position. It's not that it was bang, bang. It's not that close calls were going against us. It's just like, I'm out there thinking, like, dude, does this ACC crew know the rule book? Just a bad showing, and it feels like either we get the tier 2 ACC refs or, the ACC is just jaded against Notre Dame. And I get it because we're kind of doing the modified hybrid, independent thing. But the officiating all year, I think, has been okay, but this one was just like head scratching. And I'm really glad it was in a 51-14 game. But someone's got to be calling the ACC front office from Notre Dame after a game like this, because it's just too many of these piling up, and might not matter in this game, but it's going to matter at some point down the road. And this one was just bizarre call after call. And I thought the most bizarre thing in all of it was the ESPN booth was just like silent on it. But like the ABC guys, Greg McElroy was like saying how like, oh, like what a dumb penalty on Notre Dame, rather than actually like looking and saying, well, was it a penalty? I just thought the announcers did a horrible job covering it too.
Yeah, I was seeing people on Twitter call for national refs, and I don't know how that's probably not very easy to implement, but obviously right now we have conference refs, and if there was a more standardized, I guess, system for refereeing, obviously that would be hard to implement, I think. But yeah, it definitely was. The good thing is this is a big game. This is a game where we won by a lot, so it really was not an issue. But if this game was a lot closer, I think these calls would have they would have stuck with us a lot more, right? It's easy to just dismiss these if we're up by 30 points or whatever. But if in a close game, if we say we had a tie game and we had that roughing the passer penalty, like I feel like the fan base would be absolutely livid. They definitely would be. There's no question. So yeah, with you on it, Brett. I'm glad you got an opportunity to rant about the refs. I feel like you haven't gotten many opportunities to do that on the podcast. I've heard many of these rants off air. So, and I would say
We'll try to keep them that way.
This was a bit tamer, but yeah, all in, I think these were great takeaways. Yeah, and I think we can move into our next segment, which is how great our defense is in historical context. So I'll just tee it up in terms of just for context about where we're at right now. Right now, our defense is ranked number 6 in SP Plus with a rating of 12.8. So to give you context on what that 12.8 means, that means that if Notre Dame is playing an average offense, we would be expected to give up 12.8 points on a neutral field. Now, the number one defense in the country, for reference, is Ohio State, and they have an 11 rating. So we're not too far off. So we're about 1.8 points different than Ohio State. 1.8 points different than Ohio State. So they're a little bit better than us, but we're pretty close. So we went through the history books of SP Plus to see what was the last time Notre Dame was actually that close to being the best defense in the country. Where you're truly in that elite conversation. And not even just on defense. We looked on both offense and defense. So Brett, I'll kick it off to you if you want to dive into some of our findings.
Yeah, so we went and looked on both sides, and just 7 times so far has it happened where we've had a unit that was not only just top 5 or top 3 or top 10 or whatever, but we're very, very close to that number 1 unit in the country. So they were, in this case, we're 1.8 points behind Ohio State. That's happened. Or if you're on offense, same thing, right? Like would score, not how many points would you allow against the average team, but how many points would you score against the average team. And so let me start on offense. It's happened just 4 times. In 91 and 92, back-to-back years, we had top 5 offenses, and they played within 2 to 3 points of those number 1 units. And, some absolute Notre Dame Hall of Famers in that group: Rick Meyer, Reggie Brooks, Tony Brooks, Jerome Bettis, like just some of the all-time great Notre Dame offenses in that stretch. 2009, I think very famous, end of the Charlie Weiss era, where we could just do nothing right on defense, but had some electric offenses. That was Jimmy Clausen's big year. Armando Allen in the background, or in the backfield. Michael Floyd, a wide receiver, as an underclassman. And then in 2015, we were the number 6 offense. That was Deshaun Kaiser's first year. And really before the wheels fell off in 2016, I think we remember so much about Deshaun Kaiser being the 3-9 year. But that first year with him as a starter with a healthy Will Fuller, CJ Procise, Josh Adams, that 2015 squad was absolutely electric and balanced on offense.
And the offensive line.
Oh, yeah. It was just game-changing, right? Just some legit NFL talent out there. The defenses is a little more interesting. An obvious one and a surprise. There's only been 2 so far, and this year would be the 3rd. 1988, no surprise. Number 3 defense in the country. Interestingly, according to SP Plus, the number 1 defense was none other than Miami, the big rival that year. The other one was shocking to me. In 2002, we had the number 3 defense under Ty Willingham in his first year. Justin Tuck was a sophomore, and that was really it in terms of what turned out to be NFL talent. A couple guys made their way to the practice squad. Courtney Watson, Mike Goolsby. The big name was Shane Walton. I always forget about Shane Walton. Shame on me. I'm sorry, Shane, if you ever listen to this show. He walked on as a sophomore, and by his senior year, had 7 interceptions and was a unanimous All-American. What a crazy story to lead one of the absolute most elite defenses in Notre Dame's history. Feels like it kind of went to waste in the Ty Willingham era. Not kind of. It did go to waste in the Ty Willingham era. That's it. 6 units, 4 on offense, 2 on defense. What Al Golden is doing right now with a top 6 defense and really right there statistically with any one of those others, all the way up to the number 1 efficient defense in the country, Ohio State. You could flip a coin and you're splitting hairs. Like, you can debate with people that Notre Dame has the best defense in the country. We have only had that 7 times in the last 40 years. Remarkable, like, just such a special season that I think going through some of this history saying, like, really 1988 and 2002 are the only time where our defense in this, what we view as the all-important efficiency metric, is in that upper echelon of elite. Really, really cool season to watch that play out.
Yeah, I agree. It's one. I think one surprise was, and there's just like a lot of emotion tied up in the season. We were on campus, but 2012, right? That was a great defense that year, and I was maybe a bit surprised to see that it wasn't in this category, but it's not. I wouldn't say it's not exactly far off. It was number 6 defense that year, which is the same as where we're ranked right now. But with SP Plus, right, you have ranking and you have rating, so the ranking doesn't necessarily tell you the full picture here. So that year, there was just a much larger gap. We were number 6, but there was a much larger gap in the rating between us and the number 1 team, which was Florida. So we're clearly a great defense that year, but there was one team that year in particular, Florida, who was just a cut above everyone else. So I guess taking a step back, we've gone through all the accolades, pressure rates, pass coverage, stacking up, top 5, top 10, all these categories, demonstrating improvement as the season has gone. But I do think the historical context here is crazy, as you were hinting at, Brett. I think it's just, as you mentioned, the fact that it's just one of the top 7 units that we've had over this stretch is pretty crazy. And it's great because we also expected this. It's rare that, I think it is rare that you have a unit with such high expectations and then they end up living up to it. And we've had a lot of injuries too. That's the thing. We've been able to do this despite having a lot of key injuries, and it doesn't seem like we've been slowing down at all. In fact, it seems like we're continuing to improve. Navy game notwithstanding, I still think that this is a defense that is surging. And I mean, one other thing I want to call out here is that our offense this year is no slouch either. So the efficiency metrics have really been improving for on the offense for us. So we started out slow. We had some middling, mediocre performances, but lately we've had a lot of very efficient performances. 3 straight games with success rates of 49% or higher. That's exactly where you want to be. And success rate is such a key. It's just such a key metric in terms of how you're going to rate in SP Plus. And another key factor, which we also mentioned a bit earlier in the show too, is that our opponents are looking better and better as well. Texas A&M, we mentioned the big win against LSU. Now they're 13 overall in SP Plus. So all that means is like now I think people would be surprised to learn that we're actually number 11 on offense at SP Plus. So we got the number 6. We have essentially what amounts to about a roughly top 5 defense. But then our offense is almost at a top 10 level as well, which I think is pretty surprising and or would be surprising to a lot of people. So, and again, a lot of that's, as I mentioned, due to these recent performances, due to these factors that we've been waiting on Riley Leonard finally playing like the quarterback we were expecting, like the offensive line maybe starting to gel a little bit, the running game starting to work a little bit better, our receivers seeming a bit more comfortable. So I think all this just means that we're in a great spot right now. And if you combine everything, we're number 7 overall. We would be 4.4 point underdogs against Texas, who's ranked number 1 in SP Plus overall on a neutral field. And that means you would be competitive. That means you're not going to be favored, but you would be competitive in that game. It means you definitely have a shot to win that game. And then against a bunch of the other top teams, Georgia, Oregon, Alabama, we'd be 2 or 3 point underdogs. So again, it's not quite a coin flip, but if we're having a particularly good game, or not even a particularly good game, if we're having a good game and they're maybe a little bit off, that's a game that you feel comfortable that we would come away with a win. And then Penn State and Miami, two other contenders, those are essentially coin flips. So I think for me, this is a very interesting year because I think if Notre Dame can run the table, this is not your typical college football experience where there's just one or two teams that are just head and shoulders above everyone else and will just annihilate anyone that and they play. This is a season where there are a lot of contenders, and I think it's critical that we just make the playoff this year because if we make it, this seems like a year where there could be a lot of interesting things that happen. There could be a lot of shakeups. We could, even if we get matched up against the number one team at some point, we could actually come away with a win in that scenario. And all these teams are pretty close, though. There could be some weird stuff that happens. So I think this is also just a credit to Freeman about how we're doing, how he's really recovered from NIU, how he's built up this level of performance. We've had good teams in the past. We've had teams that have even been ranked number one. 2012, we were ranked number one at one point. But this is really the first time that I can recall I mean, I don't know, like certainly since I've been a fan, which is 2010, I cannot recall a time where this feels like a scenario where we could actually knock off some top teams. Like it doesn't feel fluky to me. This feels like we actually have a potentially great team here, and we're still poised for more improvement too.
There's been such an overhang from that Northern Illinois game. We were riding high with a huge, massive win against Texas A&M. Now a top 10 road victory, but one of the best wins in the country on the season. And we sat here on this show in August and said, Notre Dame's a contender for the first time since we've done the show, and arguably a true contender for the first time since 2012. And we meant that in the sense that we were going into a season where we expected to be there in the end and have a close spread against Vegas, like according to Vegas. And that's what we're talking about here. When we say SP Plus says it would be about a 4.5-point underdog against Texas or a 2 to 3 point underdog against Georgia, Oregon, Alabama, we're saying that's what the Vegas spread should be, whether it is or not, or where bettors go, or does the line move, or different things can happen, or injuries, or you name it. But like if everyone's at full strength, the line should be in that 2 to 5 point range against any team. We haven't been in that scenario as a program. We haven't been producing on-field results that gives the data that says, yep, they're not just winning games. This is a legit team that's blowing people off the ball, play in and play out. And that's happening. And so going into this bye week, I think it's time turning the page into November where Notre Dame fans you can't forget about NIU. Like that can't happen again. You need to evaluate your coach on it. Like he needs to, like that needs to permanently stay on his resume as you think about things in the future. If other things unravel or that keeps happening or everything else, like that's strike two. If not, it's not strike three, like that's strike two. But for this season, I'm staring at the schedule, and for what we have left, we have a 96% chance to beat Florida State. We have a 96% chance to beat Virginia. I think last I saw was 87% chance to beat Army. Like we are going to be multiple score favorites against our next three games, be 10-1 going into a rivalry game at USC where frankly, they might be playing for bowl eligibility. I mean, like that's just a program that's like in complete free fall at 4-4. I'm expecting them to get to 6 wins, but I mean, they're not going to be playing meaningful football, and we're going to be playing for a spot in a college football playoff. Like that is about as good of a situation as you can be in coming out of the NIU game. Sucks that, if we don't lose that game, like we're arguably the number 2 team in the country behind Oregon right now. Like I think it'd be really hard to put us in number 3. And so that NIU game is so frustrating that it happened. But everything after that is exactly what a Notre Dame fan should have been looking for. And now it's time to return our attention to say, folks, like we got to be talking about not just like making the playoffs, but make some noise in the playoff, because each of those games will be toss-ups. Each of those games, I don't know, maybe 40%, 50%, 60%. Like that's going to be the range of outcomes. But we won't be a 20% chance to beat Alabama in 2020. Like that's not the matchup we're talking about. And that just gets me super excited to be watching football, cheering for chaos, like cheering Notre Dame keeps moving up, cheering for, oh, like, are we getting positioned for a home game or not? Like, we are back to needing to have that mindset as a fan base. And that is an awesome place to be as we end October and head into November.
Yep. It's yeah, it's just I think it's just the NIU game. It's I mean, we're going to keep talking about it because it was such a crazy thing that happened this year. But the fact that the numbers say that we're, not just a playoff team, but a playoff contender, despite a data point as horrible as NIU, I think that just tells you how well we've been able to right the ship. Now, the one thing that I think is critical going forward, because this would not be the first time that we as a program are starting to feel comfortable under Marcus Freeman, and then we go out and lay an egg. So I think certainly our guards up. NIU happened already. It sounds like Marcus Freeman is he's reminding the team of that NIU game pretty frequently. It sounds like he's using it as a motivational tactic. He's reminding them it of them constantly. But I think it's I really want to see us just not even give our next three opponents any opportunity to have a shot at knocking us off. I want to see the defense just flying to the ball, looking more like less like the team that we saw against Navy and more what we saw elsewhere this season, and then the offense continuing to take steps. But yeah, Brett, it's exciting because again, we keep saying this, but the numbers say that we're a contender, and I think it's just a very different feeling if you get into the playoff and you feel like you actually have a real shot at making some noise. As you mentioned, we're not 20-point underdogs to Alabama where you need them to turn the ball over 4 times to even have a chance at winning. This is a totally different scenario. This is where if we play well, we should win,
Absolutely. So with that, enjoy the bye week, and when we get back at it, we'll be previewing the Florida State game.
Yep. All right.
Cool. Go
Irish.
Irish.
Irish eat cheeseburgers.
Have a good one. Happy Halloween, everyone.
You're going.